Luke Bradford pressed his dead wife's locket so hard against his chest that it left a mark in his skin. 10 years. 10 summers of silence, cold mornings, and a ranch that felt more like a grave than a home. He had turned away every woman in Millstone Creek, not with cruelty, but with a silence so deep it frightened them off. But on the hottest July morning in 20 years, a woman he'd never once seen stepped into the middle of the road, planted both feet in the dust, looked him dead in the eye, and said 5 words that cracked something open in him he thought was sealed forever. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word, because this one doesn't end where you think it will. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 came down on Millstone Creek like a punishment. The kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin. It got inside your chest and stayed there, pressing against your ribs until breathing felt like work. The dirt roads cracked open in long, pale lines, and the horses moved slower than usual, heads hanging, like even they had given up on expecting relief. Luke Bradford had ridden into town every 3rd Saturday for the past decade. Not because he wanted company, not because he enjoyed the noise and the dust and the way people looked at him with that particular mixture of pity and fear that he'd learned to ignore. He came for flour, salt, and tobacco. He came for the few things a man couldn't grow or kill on his own land. He paid his money, loaded his saddlebag, and rode back out before anyone had the chance to say more than 3 words to him. The people of Millstone Creek had long since stopped trying. Clara Wells, who ran the general store with her husband, used to wave when he rode past. She'd stopped 3 years ago. Sheriff Dan Pruitt once invited him to Sunday supper. He'd asked exactly twice. Old Thomas Hale, who sat every morning outside the barber shop in the same cracked wooden chair, used to call out to him, "Mornin', Bradford! Fine day!" And Luke used to dip his hat without breaking stride. And eventually, old Thomas stopped calling and started staring at his boots instead. It wasn't that they disliked him. It was that trying to reach Luke Bradford was like trying to hold water in a closed fist. He slipped through every gap before you even knew you'd lost him. He was 38 years old, and he moved through Millstone Creek like a ghost that had forgotten it was supposed to haunt someone. He tied his horse outside the general store that Saturday morning, the sun already violent overhead, and stepped up onto the wooden boardwalk. His boots hit the planks with a sound like a slow, steady drumbeat. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He pushed open the door and walked straight to the counter. Clara Wells looked up from her ledger. "Morning, Mr. Bradford." "Morning." He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and set it flat on the counter without making eye contact. "Just what's on the list." Clara took the paper without a word. She'd long since stopped asking if he needed help, stopped making conversation about the weather or the town or anything at all. She moved to the back shelves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had accepted the terms of a relationship she hadn't chosen. That was when the bell above the door rang. Luke didn't turn around. He heard footsteps, 2 sets, small ones, quick and light, and then a voice. "Mama, can we get the peppermints? The ones in the jar by the window?" A woman's voice answered, warm but firm. "We'll see, Jack. Don't touch anything." More footsteps, the sound of small hands on glass. A giggle. Luke kept his eyes forward. Clara came back with a sack of flour and set it on the counter. She reached for the salt. She was reaching for the tobacco when the sound changed. A crash. Not a large one, just a jar knocked sideways from a low shelf, and then a boy's sharp intake of breath, followed by total silence. Luke still didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," the boy said, his voice small and tight with the kind of fear that comes when you know you've done something wrong in a place you can't afford to be careless.
Mama, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right, sweetheart.
The woman's voice was controlled, but Luke caught something under it, a thread of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one hard morning, but from years of them stacked on top of each other.
We'll pay for it. Clara, I'm sorry. We'll pay for whatever it cost.
Don't worry yourself, Maggie, Clara said. It didn't break. Luke picked up his sack and turned toward the door. That was when he saw her. She was standing near the center of the store, with a hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who looked about 9 or 10, dark-haired and wide-eyed with guilt. Beside her, holding the hem of her skirt, was a little girl, younger, maybe 6 or 7, with red ribbons in her hair, and the kind of serious face that small children get when they're trying very hard to understand what the adults around them are feeling. The woman, Maggie, Clara had called her, was looking at him. Not the way most people looked at Luke Bradford. Not with that sideways nervousness, that careful avoidance. She was looking at him directly, without apology, without the flinch he had learned to expect. She had dark auburn hair pinned back from her face, and a few loose strands had escaped in the heat and curled against her jaw. She was lean, the way working women are lean, not from vanity, but from labor. Her dress was clean, but worn thin at the sleeves. She had the kind of eyes that looked like they had seen things they couldn't unsee, and had decided to keep going anyway. Luke looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away, tucked his sack under his arm, and walked toward the door. He heard her voice before he reached it. "Excuse me." He stopped. Not because he wanted to. Something in her voice, not the word but the tone, was different enough from the usual sounds of this town that it snagged on something in his chest before he could stop it. He turned halfway, not enough to face her fully, just enough to make clear he'd heard. "You're Luke Bradford," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Maggie Callahan. I moved into the Reyes place 3 weeks ago. The property just past the creek bend." "I know where the Reyes place is." She nodded once. "Then you know it's less than a half-mile from your land." He looked at her fully then, for just a moment. "I know that too." There was a pause that stretched the length of a heartbeat. "I've been trying to fix the fence along the north boundary," she said. "The one that borders your field. 3 of my posts are rotted through. I'd have them replaced already, but the lumberyard said the delivery wagon's axle broke last week, and they're behind 2 weeks on orders." He said nothing. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, and there was an edge in it, not hostility, but a clean, plain pride that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. "I can pay. I just need to know if you have any spare post timber on your property that you'd be willing to sell." "No." The word came out of him the way it always did. Flat, fast. A door closing before anyone could get a hand through it. He watched her face for the reaction he expected. The hurt, or the anger, or the brittle politeness of someone backing down. What he got instead was none of those things. She looked at him for a long moment, her head tilted very slightly to one side, like she was measuring something she hadn't quite decided on yet. "All right," she said at last. "I'll wait on the lumber yard." She turned back to her children without another word. Luke walked out into the blazing heat. He untied his horse, loaded his saddlebag, and swung himself up into the saddle. He was halfway down the main road before he realized his jaw was clenched. He didn't know why. He'd said no to people 100 times, 1,000. It cost him nothing, and it kept everything simple. That was the arrangement he'd made with himself, and he'd never once questioned it. He rode home. He didn't sleep well that night. The heat was part of it. July in this part of Texas didn't cool down after sundown so much as shift from unbearable to merely terrible. and the air in his house sat still and thick as cloth against his face. He lay on top of the bedsheet and stared at the ceiling and listened to the cicadas outside. But it wasn't
This
just the
story
heat.
was posted on the
He
channel
kept
west
seeing
of
her
Betrayal.
eyes.
Please do not
Not in a
repost
sentimental
it in
way.
any form.
Not the way a man looks at a woman and feels something tender. More like the way you see something that doesn't match the pattern you've built your world around, and your brain keeps returning to it, turning it over, trying to make it fit. She hadn't flinched. Everyone in Millstone Creek flinched, eventually. Not always in the first moment, but they got there. There was always a point where they looked at him and understood, in some wordless way, that the space inside Luke Bradford was occupied only by something old and cold and refusing, and that there was nothing they could do or say that would change that. Maggie Callahan had looked at him like she was still deciding. He didn't know what to do with that. He pressed the locket against his palm in the dark, a habit so old and ingrained he no longer knew he was doing it, and he listened to the night sounds outside his window, and eventually some thin, restless version of sleep took him under. He saw her again 4 days later. He hadn't planned to. He'd ridden out to check the fence line on the east side of his pasture, a job he'd been putting off for 2 weeks. And when he came around the curve of the creek, there she was, on the other side of the water, on her knees in the dirt beside a fence post, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, working a rusted nail free with a tool that was clearly not designed for the job. She hadn't heard him. She was working with the focused intensity of someone too busy to notice anything they don't have to. The little girl, Ellie, he had heard Maggie call her in the store, was sitting nearby in the grass, talking to a doll with enormous seriousness. The boy, Jack, was carrying what looked like a pail of water from the creek, walking slowly and carefully so as not to spill it. Luke sat on his horse and watched for a moment. He should ride on. He knew that. He said, "You're doing it wrong." She looked up fast, startled, one hand going instinctively to her chest. When she saw him, the startled look settled into something composed. She didn't seem embarrassed to have been caught working on her knees in the dirt. "Excuse me?" she said. "The nail. If the post is rotted through, the nail's not your problem. The post is." He paused. "You pull the nail, the post still falls." She looked at the post for a moment. Then she looked back up at him. "Do you always watch people work without introducing yourself?" she said. "We've met." "In a store. You said one word and walked out." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees, unhurried. "I don't count that as an introduction." He sat on his horse. The sun hit the top of his head like a brand. The creek ran shallow and quick between them. "Luke Bradford," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Maggie Callahan." "I know." She looked at the post again. "So, if the nail isn't the problem, what do I do with a post that's rotted through?" "You replace it." "With what?" "The lumberyard is 2 weeks out, yes." He shifted in the saddle. The horse moved one step sideways and stopped. "You said you knew that." "I do know that." She looked at him steadily. "I also know you have a woodshed on the north side of your property, with posts in it. I could see them from the road." Something tightened in him. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling of being seen when you had counted on not being. "I told you I don't have spare timber." "You told me that 4 days ago. I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes." There was a silence that might have been comfortable between two different people. "Mama?" The boy, Jack, had come to stand beside her now, the water pail set down. He was looking up at Luke with large, serious brown eyes. Not afraid, just observing. The kind of look that children give when they're trying to decide whether something is safe or not. "It's all right, Jack." Maggie didn't look away from Luke. Go sit with your sister." The boy hesitated, then went. Luke watched him go. He had a walk like a boy who'd learned early to pay attention to rooms. The careful walk of a child who had figured out that adults could change suddenly and without warning. Luke recognized it because he had walked that way himself at that age, after the first bad thing happened. Before he'd grown old enough to build walls instead. Something shifted in his chest. He didn't want it to. "The fence line is as much mine to maintain as it is yours," he heard himself say. He didn't know why he said it. It was true, technically, but it wasn't why he said it. "If your posts go, my cattle could wander through. I have an interest in the repair." She looked at him without expression for a moment. "Is that so?" she said. "I'll bring 4 posts tomorrow morning. You can pay me what they're worth from the yard when your delivery comes in." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned his horse and rode back the way he came. He didn't hear what she said, if she said anything at all. He told himself it was about the fence. He told himself it was a practical decision made by a man who ran a practical ranch and had no patience for disruptions caused by deteriorating boundary markers. He told himself a lot of things on the ride home. That night, he ate supper alone at the table where he always ate supper alone, and he stared at the empty chair across from him the way he always stared at it. And he pressed the locket against his palm under the table, and he thought about a boy with a walk, like he'd learned the world could turn without warning. And he thought about a woman who looked at him like she hadn't decided yet. He didn't sleep well again. He brought the posts the next morning, as he'd said he would. 4 of them, loaded in the back of his wagon, before 8 o'clock. He hadn't thought about it as a gesture. He'd told himself it was a transaction, straightforward, bounded, nothing more. And he'd thought if he showed up early enough, before she had time to make it into something it wasn't, it would stay that way. She was already awake when he arrived. Of course she was. She was standing outside the house, with a cup of coffee in her hand, looking at the fence line, and she turned when she heard the wagon. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something shifted in her face that wasn't quite neutral either. "You came," she said. "Said I would." He unloaded the posts without ceremony. She didn't offer to help, and he didn't expect her to. But after he set the second one down, she set her coffee cup on the porch railing and came down into the yard and picked up the other end of the 3rd post before he could say anything. They carried it to the fence line together without speaking. It was the first time in years that Luke Bradford had worked alongside another person. He noticed that, the way you notice a sound you didn't realize had been absent until you hear it again. The sound of shared weight. 2 sets of footsteps in the same direction. He told himself it meant nothing. They set the posts. He worked. She handed him tools when he needed them, which she seemed to anticipate without him asking, which he found faintly disorienting. The children came outside after a while. Jack to watch, Ellie to investigate a beetle she'd found near the porch steps, with the concentrated fascination of a scientist. Jack came and stood near the fence and watched Luke work. Luke felt the boy watching him. He drove a nail into the post and said, without looking up, "You know anything about fence work?" The boy was quiet for a moment. "No, sir." "You want to?" Another pause. "Yes, sir." Luke held out the hammer. Jack looked at it. Then he looked at his mother. Maggie gave a small nod. The boy stepped forward and took the hammer with both hands, careful and serious, as if it were something ceremonial. Luke guided his hands to the right position without touching him, just pointing, adjusting the angle with a word. The boy's first strike hit the nail crooked. His second was better. His third sank it clean. Jack's face opened in a way that Luke wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just pride. It was surprise. The surprise of a child discovering that he was capable of something. And underneath it, something quieter. something that looked a lot like relief. Luke looked away.
This
Maggie
story
was
was
watching him.
posted on the channel
Not
west
with the
of
calculated
Betrayal.
look he'd been
Please
bracing
do not
for since he
repost
arrived.
it in any form.
Not with the soft, probing expression people used when they were trying to get inside your defenses. She was watching him, the way you watch something you've been trying to figure out and have just gotten one piece closer to understanding. He handed the next nail to Jack without comment. He finished the fence before noon. He loaded his tools back in the wagon. He stood beside the wagon for a moment, and there was a beat, a brief, particular kind of silence that meant something needed to be said, and neither party had said it yet. Maggie came and stood a few feet away from him. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." It needed to be done. It didn't need to be done by you. She paused. Most people in this town told me you didn't do anything for anyone. I'm starting to think they don't know you as well as they think. That landed somewhere in him, and he didn't know where to put it. Most people in this town are right, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The heat pressed down on both of them, and neither of them moved. My husband's name was Callahan, she said. He died in the Fenwick raid 6 years ago. The name hit him like a hand against the chest. He went very still. I was there, she said, quietly, watching his face. Not at the raid. I was home with the children. But I know who else lost people that day. She paused. I know your wife's name was Anna. I know she was 26 years old. Luke said nothing. He was aware of the stillness in his own body. The kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the complete absence of anything else to hold on to. I'm not saying that to hurt you, Maggie said. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I understand what you're carrying. I've been carrying my own version of it for 6 years. She looked at the fence line, then back at him. And I know that the easiest thing in the world is to let it become the only thing. He looked at her. He didn't know what was happening in his chest. He hadn't felt it in so long he almost didn't recognize it. That particular ache that isn't exactly pain and isn't exactly longing, but is something that lives between the two. He said, I should get back. She nodded. She didn't push. He climbed onto the wagon. He picked up the reins. He was looking straight ahead when he heard the screen door of the farmhouse bang open and Ellie's small voice ring out across the yard. Mama! Mama, the man fixed the fence! Can he stay for lunch? He didn't look back. He drove home. He pressed the locket against his palm the whole way. He ate lunch alone, as he always did, at the table where the chair across from him sat empty. And for the first time in 10 years, the silence felt less like shelter. It felt like something else entirely. 3 days passed before Luke Bradford allowed himself to think about Maggie Callahan again. He kept busy the way he always kept busy when something got under his skin, with work. Hard, physical, demanding work that left no room for anything else. He repaired the barn roof in the full heat of the afternoon sun. He dug out a blocked irrigation channel with a shovel until his shoulders burned and his hands bled through the calluses. He rode his fence line on the south pasture twice in one day, checking posts he'd checked 2 weeks before, looking for problems that weren't there. It didn't work. She kept finding him anyway. Not in person, but in that specific and maddening way that certain people get into your head before you've given them permission. He'd be pulling a nail and he'd hear her voice. I know your wife's name was Anna. I know she was 26 years old. He'd sit down to supper and he'd see the boy's face. Jack, swinging that hammer with both hands, missing the first strike, correcting the second, sinking the third clean. And the way his face had split open with that pure, unguarded surprise. He'd driven a nail for a child he didn't know, and it had cracked something in him. That was the part he couldn't reason his way around. On the fourth morning, he rode to town for nothing in particular. He told himself he needed twine. He bought the twine in under 4 minutes, and then stood outside the general store in the hard white sunlight and stared down the road toward the creek bend. And he knew, with the particular self-awareness of a man who has spent 10 years learning his own patterns, exactly what he was doing. He was looking for a reason. He turned his horse in the opposite direction and rode home. It was Clara Wells who broke it. She caught him the following Saturday when he came in for his regular order. She was setting a jar of peppermints on the shelf near the window. He noticed that detail immediately and didn't want to. And she turned around and said, without any preamble at all, "She's having a hard time, you know." Luke set his list on the counter. "I don't know who you mean." "Yes, you do." Clara said it without accusation, just fact. "Maggie Callahan. Her well pump went dry this week. She's been hauling water from the creek twice a day, with the children helping her carry buckets." She paused. "In this heat, Mr. Bradford?" He said nothing. "I know it's not your business," Clara said. "I know you don't make other people's problems your business. But I've watched that woman come into this store every week for a month, and I've watched her calculate every penny she spends. And I've watched her smile at my children and ask how their schoolwork is going. And I just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "She lost her husband in the Fenwick raid, same as you lost Anna." The name in someone else's mouth still hit him like cold water. "I know that," he said quietly. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Well then." She picked up his list and went to fill it. Luke stood at that counter and stared at the jar of peppermints and felt the quiet, steady pressure of something he had spent a decade refusing to feel. He picked up his order. He paid. He walked to the door. He stopped. "Does she know anything about pump repair?" he asked, without turning around. Clara's voice was carefully neutral. "I doubt it." He walked out. He didn't go that day. He went the next morning. He told himself it was a neighborly obligation, the same logic he'd used with the fence posts. A dry well was a safety issue. A woman alone with 2 children and no reliable water source was a problem that affected the stability of the surrounding properties. It was practical. It was bounded. It was nothing more. He was at her gate before 7 o'clock. The children were already outside. Ellie was on the porch with her doll, and when she saw him coming up the road, she stood up very straight and stared at him with those wide, serious eyes, and then turned around and went inside without a word. Luke dismounted and tied his horse at the post. He could hear voices inside, the girl's high voice, quick and urgent, and then the lower, quieter sound of Maggie's response. Then the door opened. Maggie came out onto the porch. She was in her work clothes, sleeves already rolled, hair pulled back, and she looked at him across the yard with an expression that was carefully arranged into something neutral. But he was starting to learn her face against his better judgment, and underneath the neutral was something that looked a lot like she'd been hoping and was trying very hard not to let that show. "Mr. Bradford," she said, "I heard your pump went dry." She was quiet for a moment. "Word travels. Clara means well. Clara should mind her business." But there wasn't real heat in it. She came down the porch steps and stood in the yard. "I've been managing." Hauling water from the creek in July with a 6-year-old is not managing. It's surviving. She looked at him directly. "Some days, surviving is enough." He met her eyes. "Some days. Not every day." She was quiet for a beat, that was one beat longer than a purely practical exchange required.
"Do you know anything about well pumps?" she said at last.
More than most. She stepped back
This
and
story was
gestured toward the
posted
side
on
of the
channel
house,
west of
and he
Betrayal.
followed her around
Please
to
do
the
not
pump,
repost it
and they
in any
stood there
form.
together in the morning heat, while he crouched down and pulled the casing open and looked at what he was dealing with. The valve seal had deteriorated. Dry weather, old hardware, simple neglect of the previous owner. Fixable. He had the parts in his own shed, salvaged from a pump he'd replaced 2 winters ago. "I can fix this," he said. "Today?" "If I ride back for the parts. Hour and a half, maybe 2. She nodded once, very controlled. "Maggie?" He said her name before he knew he was going to. She looked at him. "When did this go dry?" 4 days ago." "You've been hauling creek water for 4 days?" "I told you, I've been managing." "You should have sent word." She looked at him with something that walked the line between warmth and challenge. "You told me you don't do anything for anyone. Your words, not mine." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll be back in 2 hours," he said. He was back in 90 minutes. He fixed the pump while Jack stood at a careful distance and watched every move with those dark, serious eyes. After a while, Luke said, "Hand me that wrench, the short one." The boy handed it over without being asked twice. He had quick hands and he paid attention, which Luke respected without saying so. After a while longer, Luke said, "Your father teach you anything about mechanics?" The pause was brief, but heavy. "He was going to," Jack said. "He said when I was old enough he'd show me how engines worked. The kind in locomotives." Another pause. "He didn't get the chance." Luke worked the bolt another turn. "How old are you?" he said. 10? "You're old enough now." He kept his eyes on the pump. "If you want to learn." He heard Jack breathe in slowly. "Yes, sir. I think I'd like that." The pump pulled clean water on the first handle stroke. Ellie shrieked with delight from across the yard and ran toward it, arms out, and it was such a pure and artless expression of joy that something in Luke's chest moved before he could brace against it. He straightened up. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at the pump and not at the child or her mother. "That should hold," he said. "Check the seal every month. If it starts going dry again before fall, it'll need a full valve replacement." "I understand," Maggie said. She was standing close, closer than he'd registered. And when he turned, she was right there. And for a moment, neither of them stepped back. The heap pressed down between them, and everything went very quiet. "Luke," she said. His name in her mouth was its own small shock. She'd been calling him Mr. Bradford. He hadn't noticed how much that had become its own small wall between them, until she took it away. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the first time. For the second time, too. And for what you did with Jack." "I didn't do anything with Jack. You told a 10-year-old boy who lost his father that he's old enough to learn." Her voice was very steady. "Do you know how long it's been since a man said that to him?" He didn't answer because he didn't know what to do with the answer. She didn't push. That was one of the things about her he kept noticing. She said what she meant, and then she let it land where it landed, and she didn't dig after it. He gathered his tools and loaded them back on the wagon. He was almost done when the screen door banged, and Ellie came running out with something small and deliberate in her hand. And she ran right up to him without stopping and held it up. It was a peppermint, still wrapped. He looked down at her. "Mama said we could share," she said, with absolute gravity. "Jack has the other one. This one is for you." She had her mother's eyes, he noticed, the same quality in them, clear and direct, and not particularly concerned with whether you were comfortable or not. He crouched down to her level. He took the peppermint from her hand. "Thank you, miss," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and ran back to the house. He stood up slowly. He put the peppermint in his shirt pocket. He didn't look at Maggie's face because he was fairly certain what he'd find there, and he wasn't ready for it. He climbed onto the wagon. "I'll check it again in 2 weeks," he said. "The pump." "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't." He clicked the horse forward. He kept the peppermint in his pocket all the way home. He didn't eat it. He didn't know why. He just kept it there, small and solid against his chest, next to the locket. The 2 weeks became 1, and then the following Thursday he found himself on her road again, and this time he didn't pretend it was about the pump. He brought a load of firewood. Split and stacked and dry, more than she'd need until October, because he'd looked at her woodpile on the last visit and it was dangerously low, and he wasn't going to stand by and let her go into fall unprepared. That was what he told himself. Practical. Bounded. She came out when she heard the wagon, and looked at the load, and then looked at him. "Luke." "Before you say anything," he said, "you'll need it by September." She folded her arms across her chest. There was something in her eyes that was amused and careful at the same time. "I was going to say I have coffee on." He hadn't had coffee with another person in approximately 6 years. He said, "I can stay for a few minutes." He stayed for 2 hours. They sat on the porch in the only shade in the yard, and Maggie poured from a battered tin pot, and the coffee was strong the way he liked it. He hadn't mentioned that, which meant she'd either guessed or noticed. And they talked. Or she talked mostly, in the beginning. About the ranch. About what she was trying to make of it. About the problem with the South Paddock drainage and the state of the barn roof on the east end. Practical things. Real things. The kind of conversation that didn't require anything from him except attention and honesty. And he found that he could do both without the walls coming up the way they usually did. Then she asked, "What was she like?" "Anna." He went still. She said it quietly, without apology, but without pressure. The way you ask a question you've been holding for a while, and have finally decided is worth the risk. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the yard. "Loud," he said at last. She was the loudest person I'd ever met. Laughed at everything. Embarrassed me in public on a regular basis. He stopped. Something shifted in his throat. She grew the best tomatoes in the county, and she knew it, and she never stopped talking about it. Maggie was quiet. "She was 26 years old," he said. "I know." "Callahan," he said. "Your husband, what was his first name?" "Thomas." A pause. "Everyone called him Tom. He had a laugh like a barn door swinging open, all noise and no apology. The children have it, Jack especially." She smiled, and it was a real smile, but not an easy one, the kind that costs something. "He would have liked you, I think. He didn't have patience for people who performed, people who talked big and delivered nothing. He liked people who said less and did more." Luke looked at her. "I'm sorry for what happened," he said. "I'm sorry for what happened to you." They looked at each other across the small, difficult distance of two people who have lived with loss long enough to know that no words close it. Only presence does. And presence is its own kind of terrifying. And then Ellie burst out of the house with a piece of paper in both hands and shoved it between the two adults with the confidence of a child who has never once considered that she might be interrupting anything important. "Mama, look," she demanded. "I drew the horse." Maggie took the paper with both hands and studied it with absolute seriousness. Ellie Mae, this is extraordinary. Is that the horse? Luke said. Ellie turned to him, apparently
This story
pleased
was
to have an
posted on
additional
the
audience.
channel west of Betrayal.
That's his
Please
nose,
do not
she
repost
said,
it
pointing.
in any form.
And those are his legs. He has 4.
I can see that.
His name is Captain.
That's a fine name for a horse.
What's your horse's name?
Luke paused. Horse. Ellie stared at him.
You named him Horse?
Seemed accurate. She thought about this for a very long moment, with the gravity of a child weighing a philosophical dilemma. And then she said, "That's very boring," and took her drawing back inside. Maggie pressed her lips together, and then she laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, short and sudden, surprised out of her. And Luke Bradford, for the first time in 10 years, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, and it felt strange in his chest, like a door opening on hinges that had gone stiff with disuse. He looked away before she could see whatever was on his face. He set his cup down. "I should go."
You keep saying that,
she said. Her voice was warm and quiet, and not at all trying to stop him. "I keep meaning it."
I know you do.
A pause.
Luke,
He looked at her.
I'm not trying to turn you into something you're not.
She held his gaze.
I want you to know that.
I'm not the kind of woman who takes a broken fence and decides it means she can rebuild a man. Another pause, shorter, more deliberate. I just think you're not as unavailable as you want everyone to believe, including yourself. He had nothing to say to that. He stood up. He thanked her for the coffee. He walked to the wagon, and he climbed up, and he was picking up the reins when her voice reached him one more time. "Sunday dinner," she said. "I'm cooking. The children want you to come." A brief pause. "I want you to come." He sat with the reins in his hands. He thought of the empty chair across from him at his own table. He thought of it with a clarity that was almost physical. The specific shape of that emptiness, the exact weight of it, the way it had been so constant for so long that he had stopped registering it as absence and had started registering it as just the way things were. He thought of a boy swinging a hammer with both hands. He thought of a girl saying, "That's very boring," with complete conviction. He thought of coffee, strong the way he liked it, poured by someone who hadn't asked how he took it. "What time?" he said. He didn't look at her face when she answered. He already knew he couldn't afford to. He showed up Sunday at noon with a jar of preserved peaches from his own cellar. His annual batch, made from a tree Anna had planted the first year they'd moved onto the ranch. The only thing he'd kept up out of habit too ingrained to break. He held the jar at his side the whole walk from the wagon to the door, and he almost turned around twice, and he knocked anyway. Ellie opened the door. She looked at him, looked at the jar, and looked back at him. "You brought peaches," she said. "I made them myself." She considered this. "Jack," she hollered, without stepping back. "The man who named his horse Horse is here, and he brought peaches." From somewhere inside the house, Luke heard Jack laugh, and it was exactly what Maggie had said, that laugh. Like a barn door swinging open. All noise and no apology. And Luke Bradford stood in the doorway of a house that was not his house, holding a jar of peaches made from a dead woman's tree, and something moved through him that was not grief and was not joy, but was something quieter and harder to name than either. He stepped inside. Sunday dinner at Maggie Callahan's table was the loudest meal Luke Bradford had eaten in 10 years. Jack wanted to know everything. How to read a fence line for weak spots, whether you could tell a horse's age by its teeth, what the best kind of wood was for postwork, how deep a well had to go before it hit reliable water. He asked with the focused intensity of a boy who had been storing questions with nowhere to put them, and he fired them in rapid succession between bites of food. And Maggie told him twice to let their guest eat, and he'd slow down for approximately 45 seconds before starting again. Ellie ate with her doll propped against her water cup and offered the doll small pieces of biscuit between her own bites, narrating the arrangement in a low, serious murmur that required no audience. Luke answered Jack's questions, not briefly, the way he answered most things, but with the full, honest weight of what he actually knew, because the boy was asking with real attention, and real attention deserved real answers. He showed him, with his hands flat on the table, how to read a fence line by the tilt of the posts. He explained what a horse's teeth tell you about its years and its health. He said the best wood for post work was cedar, if you could get it. Resistant to rot, light enough to carry without killing yourself. Jack listened to every word with both hands wrapped around his cup, and his eyes fixed on Luke's face like he was memorizing something he'd been waiting his whole life to be taught. Maggie watched from across the table and said almost nothing. After dinner, after the dishes, after Ellie fell asleep on the porch bench with her doll clutched to her chest, and Jack sat nearby sharpening a stick with a penknife, Maggie clearly wasn't entirely comfortable with him having. Luke sat in the chair by the window and drank his third cup of coffee, and understood, with a clarity that was somewhere between peace and terror, that this had stopped being a transaction approximately 3 visits ago. He didn't know what to do with that. "You're quiet again," Maggie said. She was in the chair across from him, her own cup held in both hands, her voice low so as not to wake Ellie. "I'm always quiet." "You were talking 20 minutes ago. More than I've heard you talk in all our visits combined." She paused. "Jack does that to people. He opens them up. He's been doing it since he was 4 years old." "He's a good boy." "He is." She looked at her son. "He's been the man of this house since he was 8. I never wanted that for him, but he decided it was his job, and I couldn't talk him out of it." Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to say it. He needs someone to show him that being a man doesn't mean carrying everything alone. Luke looked at the boy with the penknife. He thought about being 8 years old. He thought about what he'd understood at 8 and what he hadn't. "Maggie," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know what this is." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, because dressing it up would be a lie, and she deserved better than that. "I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know how to do this anymore. I'm not sure I ever knew." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think you're doing here?" "I think I'm making an error in judgment." "Is that what you call it?" "I call it what I can name." He looked at his coffee cup. "Anna was the only woman I ever... She was the whole shape of my life. And when she died, the shape went with her, and I built something else in its place. Not a life. More like a structure. Something that keeps the weather out." Maggie said nothing. "I don't know how to take the structure down without..." He stopped. He picked up his cup and set it down again. "I don't know if there's anything worth finding underneath it." "Luke," her voice was very quiet, "I've been inside your house 3 times, and every time you've made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and you've had a jar of preserved peaches in your cellar that you made from a tree your dead wife planted, and you taught my son how to swing a hammer, and you got up before 7 in the morning twice to fix things on my property that had nothing to do with your cattle." She paused. "There's plenty worth finding underneath it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then Ellie shifted on the porch bench, and the doll fell from her arms, and the spell broke, and Luke stood up and said he needed to get home before dark, and he meant it. And Maggie let him go without protest, and he drove home in the long golden light of a Texas evening with the locket in his palm and something quietly and irrevocably shifting in his chest, like tectonic plates that had
This
been locked
story
for
was
a
posted
decade,
on the channel West of
finally
Betrayal.
moving.
Please do not repost it in any form.
He was in town buying rope on Wednesday morning when he heard the name for the first time. He was at the hardware counter, and two men were talking behind him, with the lowered voices of people sharing something they believe is serious, and one of them said, "Calloway's men were seen at the Ridgefield Crossing 2 nights ago. 4 of them, armed." Luke's hands went still on the rope. The other man said, "How far is that from here?" 40 miles east, but you know how Calloway moves. He doesn't ride straight at anything. He circles." Luke turned around. Both men looked at him. Neither of them were locals he knew well. Travelers, maybe, or men from one of the ranches further east. They had the look of people who'd been riding hard and hadn't slept properly. "Calloway," Luke said. "Dread Calloway?" The first man nodded slowly. "You know the name?" Everyone knew the name. Dread Calloway had been working his way west for 3 years, raiding, extorting, burning out small ranchers who couldn't pay him off and weren't strong enough to fight back. He wasn't the biggest threat in Texas, but he was consistent, and he was cruel in the particular way of men who have convinced themselves that what they're doing is simply business. "What's his interest in this direction?" Luke said. The two men exchanged a look. "Word is he's looking for a widow's spread along a creek somewhere in this county. Some land dispute, apparently. Something about a deed that went through probate wrong when her husband died. He claims it's his, rightfully." Luke paid for the rope. He didn't say another word. He walked to his horse and rode directly to Maggie's property without going home first. She was hanging laundry when he came through the gate at a pace he didn't usually ride. She looked up when she heard him, and immediately she knew from his face that something was wrong. She didn't ask him to slow down or explain himself. She just dropped the shirt she was holding and walked toward him as he dismounted. "What happened?" she said. "You need to tell me about your deed." He said it straight, no softening. "The land deed. Is there any dispute on it? Any question about how it passed to you after Thomas died?" Something went through her face, a flash of something old and painful before she controlled it. "Where did you hear that name?" she said. "I didn't say a name." "He didn't have to." She folded her arms across her chest. The laundry moved behind her in the hot breeze. "Dread Calloway. He's been sending letters for 6 months. He says the deed should have gone to Thomas's brother, Samuel, who sold his claim to Calloway before Thomas died." Her voice was flat and controlled. "The claim is fraudulent. Thomas and I had a proper deed, properly registered. But Samuel was always—" She stopped, breathed once. "Samuel was not a good man. He and Thomas hadn't spoken in years, but that didn't stop him selling something that wasn't his to sell." "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" "I spoke to Judge Hartley in Ridgefield. He confirmed the deed is valid. I have documentation." She paused. "Calloway doesn't care about documentation." Luke looked at her. "How long have you known he was circling this county?" Her jaw tightened by a fraction. "About 2 weeks." 2 weeks. She'd known for 2 weeks, and she'd said nothing. And he thought about all the times in those 2 weeks she'd looked at him over a coffee cup and talked about drainage problems and barn roofs, and she'd been carrying this underneath all of it, alone, the way she carried everything, because she was the kind of woman who had learned that asking for help was the first step to being told no. "Maggie." He said her name the way he always said it now, straight, her whole name, no shortening. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's not your problem." "It borders my land." "Luke, because you've been hauling my fence timber and drinking my coffee and letting me eat at your table for a month, and you didn't think, because I didn't want to be a burden." Her voice cracked on the last word. Not into tears, into something harder than tears. A kind of anger that comes from pride being pressed too far. Because every single thing I've needed since I moved onto this property, I've had to ask someone for. And I am so bone-tired of asking, Luke. I just wanted one thing I could manage alone. The words hit him somewhere specific, and he felt them land. He knew that tired. He knew it precisely, intimately, in the specific way you know a feeling you've been living with for a decade. The exhaustion of needing, and the shame of needing, and the loneliness of refusing to let anyone close enough to help, because if they got close enough to help, they also got close enough to leave. He took one step toward her, just one. "You're not a burden," he said. She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "You've never once been a burden," he said. "Not to me." There was a beat of silence that was different from the silences before it, fuller somehow, and more dangerous. Then Jack's voice came from the direction of the barn. "Mama, Captain threw a shoe. Should I—" "I'll be right there," she called back. And the moment broke, and she pressed her lips together and looked at Luke with something that was gratitude and grief and something harder to name, all mixed together. "What do we do?" she said. "First, you show me the documentation. Everything Hartley signed, everything you have on the deed. Then we figure out what Calloway actually has and what he doesn't." He said it the way he made decisions, direct and without drama, already moving. "And you don't stay here alone at night, not until we know how close he is." She opened her mouth. "That's not a discussion," he said quietly. "That's me telling you what we're doing." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "All right." And that was the second time in Luke Bradford's adult life that a woman had said, "all right," to him, in a voice that meant something larger than the words. And it hit him in a place so deep, he had to look away. That afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table with Thomas Callahan's deed spread flat between them, Luke read every document she had. He was not a lawyer, but he was a man who had spent 20 years managing property in a state where land disputes could turn violent overnight, and he knew what he was looking at. The deed was clean. Maggie was right. The registration was proper. The date was prior to any claim Samuel Callahan could have sold, and Judge Hartley's authentication was unambiguous. "This is solid," he said. "I know it's solid. The law knows it's solid." She sat across from him, with her hands flat on the table. "Calloway doesn't work through the law, Luke. He works through fear." "What does he want exactly? The land or the money?" "He wants me gone." Her voice was even. "If I leave, the land sits vacant. He can claim adverse possession within a year and sell it to whoever's developing the Northern Corridor." She paused. "I looked it up. The Northern Corridor Railroad Survey goes right through this property. It's worth 4 times what it costs." Luke sat back. That was the kind of money that made men like Calloway patient. That was the kind of money that made burning a widow out of her home feel like arithmetic. "Has he threatened you directly?" Luke said. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, he saw something she'd been keeping behind her teeth for a long time. "A man came to the door 3 weeks ago," she said. "He didn't give a name. He said he was passing through. He said, and I'm telling you exactly what he said, 'This is nice land for a woman alone. Accidents happen on nice land.'" She met Luke's eyes. He looked at the children when he said it. Something went very cold and very focused in Luke's chest. "What did you do?" he said. "I told him to get off my property." "And?" He laughed. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and he tipped his hat, and he left. Her voice was perfectly steady. "And then I went inside, and I sat on the kitchen floor with both children, until I stopped shaking. And then I got up and made supper. Luke stared at the deed without seeing it. He thought about a man standing in this doorway, looking at Ellie and Jack, saying, "Accidents happen." He thought about 10 years of building walls to keep everything
This
at a
story
distance,
was posted on the
and
channel
how very
west
thin
of
and
Betrayal.
useless those walls
Please do
felt
not
right now,
repost it in any
against
form.
the particular cold fury that had settled over him since the moment she'd said those words. "He's not going to touch your children," Luke said. "Luke, he is not going to touch them." He said it with a quiet that was not calm, but was the thing that lives below calm, below all the noise and movement that usually fills the space where a real decision has been made. "And he is not going to take your land." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright, and he could see she was fighting something back. Not weakness, but the particular emotion of someone who has been alone with a threat for 3 weeks and is hearing for the first time that they don't have to be. "You can't promise that," she said. "I'm not promising it. I'm deciding it." He looked at her straight. "There's a difference." A long moment. "What are you planning to do?" she said. "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Pruitt tomorrow, with copies of these documents. And I'm going to contact Hartley directly and get him to put something on record in this county, not just Ridgefield." He folded his hands on the table. "And I'm going to make sure that everyone in Millstone Creek knows this land belongs to you and that you're not alone." She absorbed this. "People in this town barely know me," she said. "They know me." He said it without pride, just fact. "I've been here for 15 years. I've never asked them for anything. I'm about to ask them for this." The words landed between them, and neither of them looked away. "Why?" she said, quietly, carefully, like someone who has been disappointed enough times that she checks the weight of good things before she lets herself feel them. "You know why," he said. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying that words could handle. Then Ellie came running in from the back of the house, with a jar of fireflies she'd caught, holding it up to show both of them, completely unaware that she'd just walked into the middle of something irreversible. "Look," she demanded. "There are 7. I counted." Luke looked at the jar. Then he looked at the child holding it. Then he looked at the mother, watching him look at her child. "That's a fine collection," he said. Ellie turned the jar in her hands, watching the lights pulse. "Jack says we have to let them go, or they'll die." She considered this with obvious conflict. "But they're so pretty." "Jack's right," Luke said. "Some things you have to let out to keep." She wrinkled her nose. "That doesn't make sense." "It will when you're older." She thought about it a moment more, then went back outside. Through the window, a second later, he could see the jar open and the lights scatter up into the dark summer air. Maggie said nothing for a while. Then, "Stay for supper." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to fix anything tonight," she said. "I'm just asking you to stay." He looked at the deed still spread on the table. He looked at the window where Ellie stood with an empty jar. He looked at his own hands and the calluses on them, and the thin white line of scar on his left palm from a fence wire that had snapped 15 years ago, and all the small marks of a life lived and lost and survived. "All right," he said. And somewhere in the quiet weight of those 2 words, something he'd been holding shut for 10 years opened 1 full inch wider, and he felt the air come in, and it was terrifying and necessary, and already at this point completely beyond his control. Sheriff Dan Pruitt had been the law in Millstone Creek for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had learned to read the difference between a man who came into his office with a complaint and a man who came in with a decision already made. Luke Bradford came in with a decision already made. He set Maggie's documentation flat on Pruitt's desk at 8 o'clock Thursday morning. The deed, Hartley's authentication, the records of the letters Calloway had sent, and Maggie's own written account of the man who had come to her door and looked at her children and said, "Accidents happen on nice land." He set it down and he stood back and he said, "I need this on official record in this county today, not next week." Pruitt read through the papers slowly. He was a careful man, not a fast one, which Luke had always respected, even when it frustrated him. He turned each page with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the details in documents like these were the difference between a family keeping their home and losing it. When he finished, he looked up. "You know who Dred Calloway is," he said. "I know who he is." "Then you know that putting his name on record in my county is going to get his attention." "Good," Luke said. "I want his attention on me." Pruitt studied him for a long moment. "This is the Callahan widow's land." "It is?" "You've known her, what, a month?" "5 weeks." Another long look. "Luke, I've known you 15 years. In 15 years, you've walked into this office once, when your own fence line was jumped by the Harker brothers, and that was 9 years ago." He leaned back in his chair. "You're telling me you're willing to put yourself in Dred Calloway's crosshairs for a woman you've known 5 weeks?" Luke looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you that a widow with 2 children has a clean deed to a piece of land, and a violent man is trying to take it from her. And I want the law in this county standing on the right side of that before he gets here. That's what I'm telling you." Pruitt held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his pen. "I'll send a rider to Hartley today. I'll have copies filed with the county recorder by end of week." He paused. "And I'll put the word out that Callahan property is under county watch. That won't stop Calloway if he's serious, but it'll slow him down and make it cost him more. That's all I'm asking." He was almost at the door when Pruitt said, "She know you're doing this?" "Yes." "She asked you to?" Luke stopped. He thought about Maggie sitting at her kitchen table, with her hands flat and her back straight, and "I didn't want to be a burden" in her voice, like something that had been there a long time before he ever heard it. "No," he said. Pruitt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Luke walked out. He went to see 3 other men that day. First was old Thomas Hale, who had stopped calling out to him years ago, and who looked startled and then suspicious when Luke pulled a chair up beside him outside the barber shop and sat down. Luke told him plainly what was happening with the Callahan property and what Calloway's intentions appeared to be, and he watched Hale's face change from suspicion to attention, to something harder and older. "I knew her husband," Hale said. "Thomas Callahan. Good man. He helped me re-roof my barn 2 winters before he died." He was quiet for a moment. "She's been here 5 weeks, and I've barely spoken to her. That's a shameful thing." "What I'm asking," Luke said, "is that people in this town know her name and know she's not alone. That's it. I'm not asking anyone to fight." "Sometimes being known is its own kind of armor," Hale said. "That's exactly right." Second was Bill Garnett, who owned the largest spread west of town, and who had enough standing in the county that his backing meant something to people who measured things that way. Garnett was harder to convince. He had his own property to protect, and his own reasons for not wanting conflict. But when Luke showed him the documentation and explained the railroad survey corridor, Garnett's eyes sharpened immediately. "If Calloway gets that land," Garnett said slowly, "and the railroad comes through, he starts leveraging every other property in that corridor," Luke said, "including yours." Garnett was quiet. "I'm not a man who comes asking for favors," Luke said. "You know that." "I do know that." Garnett picked up the papers. "Leave me copies. I'll make some calls." Third was Clara Wells, who didn't need to be convinced of anything, but who needed to know, because she was the information center of Millstone Creek in ways that no official office ever had been or could be. Clara listened, and then she said simply, "I'll make sure everyone who comes through that door knows her name and what's being done
This story
to her."
was posted on the channel
Luke
west
walked
of
out of the
Betrayal.
general store
Please
into the
do not
noon
repost
heat,
it in any
and
form.
he stood on the boardwalk for a moment, and he took stock of what he'd done. He had not, in 15 years of living in this county, asked a single person for a single thing. He had asked 4 people today without a moment's hesitation. He thought about what that meant for a moment, and then he got on his horse and rode to Maggie's. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching for him. "Well," she said, "Pruitt's filing everything today. Hale's already told 6 people. Garnett's making calls." He stepped inside. Clara Wells is Clara Wells. She let out a slow breath that she'd clearly been holding for a while. "Luke, it's done. It's not finished. Calloway won't back off from paper alone. But it changes the math for him. He wants an easy target. We're making you an expensive one." She looked at him. Something moved across her face that was deep and complicated, and she pressed her lips together before it could turn into something else. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said. "Don't thank you? Don't look at me like that." She was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" He didn't answer, because the answer would have required words he hadn't used in 10 years and wasn't sure he remembered how to hold. She looked at him a moment longer, and then she took a step back and said, "Sit down. I have coffee on." He sat. She poured. And the domesticity of it, the way she moved in her own kitchen, the way the cup landed in front of him at exactly the right angle, the way she sat down across from him with her own cup in both hands and her bare feet on the floor, and her hair slightly loose from the morning's work, hit him in a spot below his sternum that he was getting tired of bracing against. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice had changed, still steady, but with a different quality underneath. The quality of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is committed to it all the way through. He looked at her. "When I moved here," she said, "I wasn't running from anything. I want you to know that. I came here because the land was affordable and the soil is good, and this was the best place I could find to build something for my children." She paused. "But I was also—" She stopped, looked at her cup, looked back up. "I was also so tired of feeling like I was holding everything by myself that I didn't know what to do with it anymore. And I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you've been showing up for 6 weeks, and you've been showing up in the quietest possible way, and I think you deserve to know what that's meant." He held very still. "You fixed my fence," she said. "You fixed my pump. You brought wood I didn't ask for. You sat at my table and you answered my son's questions like they mattered. And today you went to 4 people, 4, Luke, you, who doesn't ask anyone for anything. And you did it for my children." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "I don't know what you think this is, or what you're willing to call it, but I know what it feels like from where I'm sitting." He looked at her for a long time. "Maggie," he said, and then he stopped. He thought about Anna. He thought about the locket. He thought about 10 years of a structure that kept the weather out, and the particular peace of that, and the particular loneliness of it, and the way it had felt like the only honest thing available to him after everything that was warm had been taken away. He thought about Jack swinging a hammer. He thought about Ellie calling him boring for naming his horse Horse, and how that single moment had felt like more genuine human contact than anything he'd experienced in the better part of a decade. He thought about Maggie on the kitchen floor, both children around her, shaking, and then getting up and making supper. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I'm not a man who... He paused. I have not let anyone in this door since Anna died. Not one person. I know that makes me... It makes you someone who got hurt very badly, she said, without hesitation. That's all it makes you. He looked at his hands. I'm afraid, he said. He said it the way he said things. Plainly, without drama. But it cost him more than almost anything he'd ever said out loud. I'm afraid that I'll let this become something and then something terrible will happen. Her voice was quiet and certain. I know. I think about that too. She looked at him across the table. Thomas and I had 11 years, and then I lost him in one night. And I spent 2 years after that thinking that it would have been easier if I'd never had him at all. If I'd never let it be real. She paused. And then Ellie said something to me. She was 4. She didn't know what she was saying. She said, Mama, don't be sad. Daddy was happy. And I thought, he was. Whatever time we had, he was happy. And so was I. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you if the fear is worth what you'd be giving up. The kitchen was very quiet. From outside came the sound of Jack and Ellie somewhere in the yard. The girl's high laugh, the boy's lower voice, the specific sound of children being children in summer heat. Luke looked at the window. Then he looked at the locket in his own palm, where he'd put it without realizing, the way he always did. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't touch it. Her name was Anna, he said. She laughed at everything. She grew the best tomatoes in the county. He pressed his fingers flat on the table. I'm always going to love her. I want you to know that up front. I'm not a man who stops. I don't know how. I know, Maggie said. I love Thomas the same way. She looked at the locket and then at him. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking if there's room for something else alongside it. He looked at her for so long that the quality of the light changed while he was looking. Then he picked up the locket and put it in his pocket and said, I think you should move to my ranch. She went very still. That's not... He stopped. He pressed his jaw together. I have more room. Defensible position if Calloway's men come, and I've got... He caught himself. It makes tactical sense. Tactical sense, she repeated, and there was something in her voice that was almost a smile, but careful. You and the children, the back rooms. He kept his eyes forward. Until this is resolved. She was quiet for a moment. Is that the only reason? He said nothing. Luke. It makes tactical sense, he said again, and this time she did smile, briefly and quietly, and she said, All right, we'll come. They moved the following Saturday. It wasn't a big operation. Maggie packed practically and quickly. Children's things first, then kitchen essentials, then her own box of Thomas's papers and the 2 photographs she kept on the nightstand. Jack carried things without being asked and kept his face neutral with the effort of a boy trying to be useful rather than emotional. Ellie asked 7 questions about where her room would be, whether Captain would be in the same barn as Horse, whether she could pick tomatoes from Luke's garden, and whether he had a cat. He didn't have a cat. She considered this a significant deficit. He set them up in the 2 back rooms, which he'd cleaned out the previous week with an efficiency that he refused to acknowledge meant he'd been planning it longer than Saturday. He showed Jack where things were. He showed Maggie the well, the cellar, the woodshed, the layout of the property's defensible points, which she listened to with the calm attention of a woman who had stopped being frightened by the word defensible about 3 weeks earlier. That night, for the first time in 10 years, Luke Bradford ate supper at his own table with people across from him, and the empty chair that had been there so long he'd stopped seeing it was filled by a 10-year-old boy who asked him how far sound carries on flat land at night. And the answer to that
This
question
story was
led to a
posted on the
20-minute
channel West of
conversation about
Betrayal.
acoustics
Please
and
do not
weather patterns
repost it in
and
any
what
form.
different animals do before a storm. And Luke gave his full and honest attention to every word of it. After supper, after the children were in their rooms, Maggie stood at the kitchen sink washing up, and Luke stood beside her drying. And they did it in the kind of silence that is not empty, but full, the silence of two people who are comfortable enough with each other that they don't need to fill every moment with noise. Then she handed him a cup and said, "You have an extra chair at this table." He looked at the table. "It's been empty a long time," she said. "Yes." "You don't have to explain it. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him sideways. "I'm just glad it isn't empty tonight." He took the cup. He set it in the cabinet. "So am I," he said, and it was so plainly and simply meant that she didn't respond to it at all, just nodded. And that was exactly right. The trouble came 11 days later. Luke was in the barn before dawn when he heard hoofbeats. Not one set, multiple, coming from the South Road at a pace that had nothing to do with a neighborly call. He was at the barn door with his rifle before the first rider cleared the gate. There were 4 of them. They pulled up in the yard when they saw him. They were the kind of men who wear their intentions in the way they sit a horse, loose and ready and certain of their numbers. The one in front had a face that looked like it had been used for a long time without much care, weathered and flat-eyed, and entirely without the quality that makes a face human. He looked at Luke, and then at the rifle, and then back at Luke, with a complete absence of alarm. "Looking for the Callahan woman," he said. "Heard she moved off her property." "She did," Luke said. "Heard she moved here." "What you heard is between you and whoever told you." The man looked at the house. The windows were dark, but Luke knew, without looking, that Maggie was already awake. He'd heard the floorboards creak twice in the last 2 minutes, and the sound had moved from the back room toward the kitchen. "Mr. Calloway sent us to have a conversation," the man said. "Civil. He's a civil man." "Is he?" "He wants the widow to understand her situation. She's holding land that belongs to Mr. Calloway by right of purchase, and he's been patient long enough. That land belongs to Maggie Callahan by right of a valid deed registered in this county and authenticated by Judge Hartley of Ridgefield. The sheriff of this county has official copies on file." Luke looked at each of the 4 men in sequence, and then back to the one in front. "That's the conversation. It ends there." The flat-eyed man looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality of someone recalculating distance. "Mr. Calloway is going to want to hear more than that," he said. "Then Mr. Calloway can come himself, with a lawyer, to a courthouse." Luke kept his voice even and his hands still. "He sends men to a widow's door at 5 in the morning again. It won't be a conversation. We understood each other?" A long beat. Then the sound Luke had been listening for without knowing it. The screen door, quiet but definite, and footsteps on the porch boards.
This story was
He
posted
didn't
on
turn
the channel
around.
West of
He
Betrayal.
kept his eyes on the
Please
4
do not
men,
repost it in
but
any
he felt
form.
her there behind him, her presence, the quality of her stillness. The particular way Maggie Callahan stood when she was not frightened and not backing down. The flat-eyed man looked past Luke to the porch. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "I heard you," Maggie said, from behind Luke's right shoulder. Her voice was clear and entirely level. "You tell Mr. Calloway that I have been to the sheriff and the county recorder and the judge in Ridgefield, and every one of them has paperwork with my name on it. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on, and every day he keeps trying, he's making that more expensive for himself." A pause, brief and deliberate. And you tell him that I'm not alone." The four men looked at Luke. Luke looked back at them. The flat-eyed man held the stare for 5 seconds. Then he turned his horse. The other three followed. They rode back out the gate at the same pace they'd come in, South Road, disappearing into the pre-dawn dark. Luke stood in the yard until he couldn't hear hoofbeats anymore. Then he turned around. Maggie was standing on the second porch step in her house dress, with both arms wrapped around herself against the early morning chill, and her face was composed and clear, and her hands were shaking. He walked to the porch and stopped at the bottom step, looking up at her. "You all right?" he said. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." He nodded. He stood there, and he let her shake for a minute, without trying to fix it, because it wasn't a problem to be fixed, and she wasn't a woman who needed to be handled. And after a moment, her shoulders dropped and her breathing steadied, and she looked at him with eyes that were bright and direct and not afraid anymore. "They'll be back," she said. "I know. With Calloway this time, or more men." "Probably." She looked at him. "Are you going to leave?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she saw everything she needed to see. Not a man performing bravery, not a man making a gesture, but a man who had made up his mind somewhere in the past 5 weeks without fully realizing it. And now the decision had simply arrived at the surface, plain and unhurried and permanent. "No," he said. She breathed out slowly. From inside the house came the sound of small footsteps. Ellie, awake, calling for her mother in a sleepy voice that didn't yet know anything had happened. Maggie looked at the door and then back at Luke. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He followed her up the steps and through the door, into the house that was his house, but felt different now. Fuller, warmer, occupied in a way it had not been for 10 years. And the door closed behind them both. And in the yard, the sky began to lighten, and the first bird started, and somewhere in the still cooling dark, a man named Dread Calloway was deciding his next move. But inside, there was coffee, and there were children waking up, and there was the sound of 2 people who had each lost everything once, beginning, with extraordinary care, to build something new. And that, for this morning, was enough. Dread Calloway came himself 3 days later. Luke had been expecting it. When you send 4 men and they come back empty-handed, you either fold or you escalate. And nothing in Calloway's history suggested a man who knew how to fold. He came at mid-morning, which was its own kind of statement. Not the pre-dawn hour of intimidation, but the bright open daylight of a man who believed he had legitimate standing and wasn't afraid to be seen. He came with 2 men instead of 4, which meant he was making a show of confidence rather than force. And he came in a good coat, which meant he thought this was still a negotiation. Luke was at the fence line with Jack when they rode in. He'd seen the dust from the South Road 2 minutes earlier, and he'd said to the boy, quietly, "Go inside and stay with your mother and sister." And Jack had looked at the approaching riders, and then at Luke, and said, "Yes, sir," and gone without argument, which told Luke a great deal about what kind of boy he was dealing with, and what kind of man he was going to become. Calloway pulled up 10 feet from where Luke stood. He was older than Luke had expected. Mid-50s, thick through the chest, with the patient and deliberate manner of a man who had learned that most problems could be solved by simply outlasting the other person's nerve. He had sharp eyes under a flat brow, and he used them the way experienced negotiators do, reading everything before saying anything. He looked at Luke for a moment. Then he looked at the house. "Bradford," he said. "Heard you were involved." "Heard right." "That surprises me some. You've got a reputation for keeping to yourself." "People's reputations change," Luke said. Properties don't. That deed is valid.
This story was posted
Calloway
on the channel
shifted
west
in
of
his
the
saddle.
trail. Please do
He
not
had the
repost
unhurried
it in any
quality of a
form.
man who had not yet decided to be aggressive. I've got a bill of sale from Samuel Callahan dated prior to the widow's registration. Samuel Callahan sold what wasn't his to sell. Hartley's documentation is unambiguous. The county recorder has copies. Sheriff Pruitt has copies. Luke looked at him steadily. You've seen all of that. You're here because you're hoping I don't have the stomach for what comes after the paperwork. Calloway looked at him, a long, measuring look. Railroad money's significant, Bradford. It is. Man in your position could use a partner on a corridor deal. I'm not unreasonable. The offer landed in the space between them, and Luke let it sit there for a moment. Let it fully reveal itself for what it was. A buyout, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of partnership. You're offering me money to step aside, Luke said. I'm offering you a share of a profitable arrangement. The answer is no. Calloway's expression didn't change much, but something in it settled into a colder register. That's a significant amount of money to say no to. I've said no to things that mattered more. A beat. Then the screen door opened. Maggie came down the porch steps with her arms at her sides and walked across the yard and stopped beside Luke. Not behind him, beside him. And she looked at Calloway with the direct, unwavering quality that Luke had first seen in the general store 5 weeks ago and had never once seen waver. Mr. Calloway, she said, this is my land. My husband earned it, and I've registered it, and there is not a court in this state that will find otherwise. Her voice was even and clear. I know what you paid Samuel. I know you thought you were buying me out before I even knew you were coming. That was a poor investment, and I'm sorry for your loss. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded like a woman who had made her decision and arrived at the other side of fear. Go home. Calloway looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Luke. You're choosing a widow's land dispute over a railroad corridor deal. I'm not choosing anything over anything, Luke said. I'm telling you the same thing Pruitt and Hartley and the county recorder told you. The answer is no, and the law is clear. The next step you take, you're taking against me and against every man in this county who signed on behind this deed. He paused once. Ask around before you decide if that's worth it. Calloway held the stare for 5 seconds. 10. His 2 men sat their horses without moving. Then he said, You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be my first, Luke said. Calloway turned his horse. His men followed. They rode out the gate and down the south road, and they didn't look back. And Luke and Maggie stood in the yard and watched them go, and said nothing until the dust settled. Then Maggie let out a breath that had clearly been contained for the full length of that conversation. He'll try something else, she said. He will. Something that doesn't involve a conversation.
This story
Probably.
was posted on the channel
Luke
west
turned to
of
look
the
at her,
trail.
but it'll cost
Please
him
do
more
not
than he
repost
expected to
it in any
spend.
form.
And men like Calloway don't stay interested in expensive problems. There are easier targets. He held her gaze. We make it expensive enough. He moves on. She looked at him for a moment. You sound certain. I've dealt with men like him before. He paused. Not identical, but the pattern's the same. They're not loyal to causes. They're loyal to margins. She absorbed this. Then, Jack was watching from the window the whole time. Luke turned to look at the house. In the front window, barely visible, a 10-year-old face disappeared quickly from view. Something moved in Luke's chest that was warm and complicated, and entirely without a name he was ready to use. He's learning, Luke said. He's learning from you, Maggie said. I want you to know that I noticed that." He said nothing, but he didn't look away from the window either. Calloway's next move came 6 days later, and it wasn't what either of them expected. It came not as men on horses, but as a legal filing, a challenge to Hartley's authentication on the grounds of a procedural irregularity in the original deed registration. It was thin, the kind of thin that exists specifically to create delay rather than to win. But it was real, and it had a court date attached to it, and it meant that Maggie's land was in formal dispute. Pruitt brought the papers to Luke's door in person. Luke read them at the kitchen table, while Maggie stood at the counter and Ellie sat on the floor with her doll. And Jack stood by the window in the particular way he stood when he knew something serious was happening and was trying to understand it. Luke finished reading. He set the papers down. "He's not trying to win," he said. "He's trying to delay. If the title is under formal dispute, the railroad survey team won't execute a purchase contract. He stalls long enough, they move the corridor route. You lose the value. He waits for you to sell at a loss." Maggie's jaw was tight. How long can he stall? With bad paperwork and a motivated judge? 6 months. With a good lawyer and the original Hartley documentation? He looked at her. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "I don't have money for a good lawyer." "I do," he said. The silence in the kitchen was immediate and total. Maggie looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been taking care of herself and her children alone for 6 years, and has very complicated feelings about what he'd just said. "Luke, it's not charity," he said. "It's an investment in land that borders mine, and the outcome affects my property values and my water rights." He met her eyes. "You can pay me back from the railroad corridor money if you want to. I don't need you to. But I'm not going to watch Calloway win this on a delay strategy while we sit on a valid deed because you won't let me help." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are the most frustratingly practical man I have ever met," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Her voice was tight with something that was not annoyance, but was using annoyance as a container. "And thank you. For the last time, I promise." "You said that last time." "And you keep giving me reasons to say it again." From the floor, Ellie said, without looking up from her doll, "Are we keeping the house?" The adults looked at her. "Yes, sweetheart," Maggie said. "We're keeping the house." Ellie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her doll, as if the question had been a simple administrative inquiry, and the answer resolved it completely. Jack turned from the window. He looked at Luke with those dark, serious eyes that had been measuring him since the first day at the fence post. "Mr. Bradford," he said. "Jack, are you going to stay?" The question was direct and without apology, the way important questions are when they come from children who have decided a man is worth asking. "I mean, after, when this is done. Are you going to stay?" The kitchen held its breath. Luke looked at the boy. He thought about what it cost a 10-year-old who'd been the man of his house since he was 8 to ask that question out loud in front of his mother. He thought about the courage of it, the specific, quiet, enormous courage of a child who has learned the world can take things away and asks anyway. "Yes," Luke said. "I'm going to stay." Jack held his gaze for one more second. Then he nodded, once, with the decisive finality of someone closing a chapter. "Good," he said, and picked up his rope and went outside. Luke looked at Maggie. She was looking at the door Jack had gone through, and her face was doing something she clearly hadn't prepared it for. And she pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth and looked at the ceiling, and then looked back at Luke. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Neither of them needed to. The lawyer's name was Francis Cole, out of San Antonio, and he had a reputation for being short-tempered, thorough, and expensive. He arrived 4 days later, reviewed every document in under 2 hours, and told Maggie and Luke together that the filing was exactly what Luke had diagnosed. Procedural theater designed to buy time, with no legal merit and considerable exposure for Calloway if it went in front of the right judge. "I can have this dismissed in 2 weeks," Cole said. "Possibly 10 days. "Do it in 10, Luke said. Cole looked at him. "That costs more." "I know." Cole looked at his papers. "Calloway's going to know you hired me." "Good. He's not going to like it." "I don't particularly care what Calloway likes." Cole made a sound that might have been respect. 10 days, he said, and picked up his papers and left. Maggie walked him to his horse and came back up the porch steps and leaned against the doorframe, looking at Luke with her arms crossed in the loose, tired way of someone at the end of a long run. 10 days, she said. "Maybe 11, he said. "Cole's thorough, but he enjoys his meals." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. She was too wrung out for a full one. He was sitting on the porch bench, and she came and sat beside him. Not pressed against him, but close, the way people sit when the space between them has become comfortable enough to make proximity natural rather than deliberate. They sat for a while in the evening heat without talking. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what you said to Ellie last month. About letting the fireflies go. That some things you have to let out to keep." He looked at her sideways. She said it didn't make sense. She was 6. It makes sense to me. She looked at her hands in her lap. "I held on for 6 years, Luke. Held everything so tight. The grief, the fear, the determination not to need anyone. I thought holding on was how you survived." She paused. "But you let something in for the first time in 10 years, and I watched it change your face. Not in a dramatic way, just I watched you get less quiet. I watched you laugh at something Ellie said. I watched you teach Jack how to swing a hammer, and then do it again, and then do it again until he got it right. And you never once ran out of patience." She looked up at him. "I think letting something in might be how you do more than survive." He looked at her. He had a speech somewhere inside him. He could feel the shape of it, the 10 years of reasons and hesitations and careful explanations for why he was the way he was. He could feel it all arranged and waiting. He let it go. "I brought the locket today," he said instead. He reached into his pocket and held it in his open palm between them. She looked at it. "I've carried it every day for 10 years. I put it down on your table once, and I picked it back up because I wasn't ready." He looked at it. "I'm not saying I'm ready now. I don't think that's how it works. I think you just decide, and then you do it, and the readiness comes after." He closed his fingers around the locket and then opened them again. "But I want you to know that I know the difference between the past and the present, and I know which one I'm sitting in." Maggie looked at the locket for a long time. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. "Anna would have liked you,"
This story was
she said
posted on the
softly.
channel West of Betrayal.
"That's a strange thing
Please
to
do not
say,
repost it
but I
in any
believe it.
form.
Tom would have liked you," he said. "Loud laugh, straight talker, wouldn't have tolerated any nonsense from me." She smiled, and it was the real one, the one that costs something. No, he would not have. They sat in the quiet for another long moment. Then she put her hand in his, not dramatically, not as a declaration, just quietly, the way you do something you've been thinking about long enough that the act itself is simply the arrival of a decision already made. Her hand was warm and calloused from work and entirely sure of itself, and he closed his fingers around it without hesitation, without looking at it, without making it into anything larger than what it was, which was everything. Cole got the dismissal in 9 days. Hartley's documentation held as expected. The procedural challenge was thrown out. The judge noted in his ruling that the original deed was properly registered, and that any further challenges of this nature would be considered frivolous filings. Pruitt brought the ruling to Luke's door personally, which was the second time in their 15-year acquaintance that the sheriff had done that. "It's done," Pruitt said. He looked at Luke for a moment, with the expression of a man who wants to say something and is deciding whether to say it. "You did a good thing here." "Maggie did the hard part," Luke said. "She held that deed for 6 years, and she didn't walk away." "I mean the whole of it." Pruitt looked at the house. "I mean what you did for those children. And for her." He paused. "Anna would have—" He stopped. "I know," Luke said quietly. "I know she would have." Pruitt nodded. He tipped his hat and went. The town of Millstone Creek, in the particular way of small towns that have been watching something happen before the people in it have fully named it, began to change its behavior around the two of them without announcement or ceremony. Old Thomas Hale started calling out from his chair again in the mornings, not just to Luke, but to Maggie and the children when they rode in with him. Clara Wells started keeping peppermints at the front counter at a height Ellie could reach without asking, which Ellie discovered on her third visit and treated as a natural law of the universe. Bill Garnett tipped his hat to Maggie at the lumber yard and asked about the south paddock drainage, and Maggie gave him a precise and knowledgeable answer that left him nodding with respect. Jack started an unofficial apprenticeship with the blacksmith on Tuesdays, who had told Luke privately that the boy had the best instincts for metalwork he'd seen in a young person in 20 years. Ellie decided Luke's horse needed a better name and launched a campaign of attrition that lasted exactly 4 days before Luke said, with no perceptible expression, "Fine, Captain 2. She found this deeply unsatisfying. She named him General. He let it stand. On the last Saturday of August, Maggie found him in the barn in the early evening. He was working on a bridle that needed mending, and he heard her footsteps and looked up. She was holding something small in her hand. She came and stood beside him at the workbench and set it down. It was a photograph. Not framed, just the photograph, worn at the edges, the way photographs get when they've been looked at many times. A man with a wide grin and a child on each knee, and a woman beside him, leaning in. "That's Tom," she said, "and the children when Ellie was barely 2. He looked at the photograph for a long time. "He looks exactly like you said," he said. "That laugh." "Barn door," she said. "Barn door." He looked at it a moment more. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and set the locket on the workbench beside the photograph. 2 things, side by side. They both looked at them. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I think," she said carefully, "that we have already figured out the main thing." He looked at her. "What's the main thing?" She looked back at him with those clear, direct eyes that had never once wavered from the first moment she'd put them on him, in the middle of a dusty road, and not backed down. "That we're not alone anymore," she said. He held her gaze. Then he picked up the locket, opened it once, looked at Anna's face the way he had looked at it every day for 10 years, with love and grief, and the deep, specific gratitude of a man who knows what he had. And then he closed it gently and set it back down. He picked up Maggie's hand. "No," he said, "we're not." From outside came the sound of Jack calling for Ellie, and Ellie answering back at full volume with zero consideration for the hour. And somewhere a horse moved in its stall. And the last of the August heat pressed through the barn boards, and the summer that had begun with a man pressing a locket against a scar in his chest and calling the silence around him survival, ended instead with 2 people standing in a barn with their hands joined and their dead beside them on the workbench. and they're living just outside the door. Luke Bradford had spent 10 years building walls against the weather. What he discovered on that last Saturday of August, in the barn behind the house that had become a home, was that the weather had gotten in anyway. Not as destruction, but as something older and more stubborn than either grief or fear. Something that had simply waited with the patience of all true things until he was ready to let it be real. He had been ready, he understood now, for longer than he knew. He just needed someone who refused to walk away to show him where the door was.